Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss how Canadians are impacted by and can play a role in international migration. As we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Laurier campuses are located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. I acknowledge the people who came before us on this land and all of the knowledge that has been passed down since time immemorial. The land I'm joining from has been called home by the Nehiyawak, Nakawinikwak, Nakota, Dakota, Lakota, and Dene, and is the traditional homeland of the Métis. By honoring the land, we acknowledge the teachings and wisdom gained by peoples past and bring that knowledge into the present and the future. Perhaps you're joining us from another location, and in that case, I would encourage you to take a moment to honor the Indigenous peoples who have lived and worked where you reside historically and presently. Acknowledging them reminds us of the important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and the water. My name is Ali Abukar. I am the CEO of Saskatoon Open Door Society, a community leader and refugee advocate, and I'm your moderator today. The format for today's session is that we will start with hearing from our two panelists and then have a conversation about items they have shared or your own questions. Please feel free to pop your questions into the question box and I'll post them to our panelists later. To begin the conversation, we have Dr. Robert McLeman and Dr. Ewart Shizha. I'll start with the introduction of Dr. Robert. Robert is a professor at Laurier University's Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. A former Canadian Foreign Service officer, Robert participated in a host of Canadian diplomatic missions. In recent years, he has advised the UN agencies, the World Bank, and governments in Canada, the US, and Europe on issues related to climate change, migration, security. Robert is currently a coordinating lead author for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Working Group on Impacts, Vulnerability, and Adaptation. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction, Ali. Very kind of you. Thank you to the organizers for having me as part of this group. I'm just going to share my screen, which is always that moment of fear in every presenter's mind when it comes up. And I think that it's shared okay. Give me the thumbs up, Ali, if it looks good from you. All right, thank you. So thank you, especially to those of you who've decided to join us over your lunch hour, especially if you're in Eastern Canada, to think about and help us discuss the future of international migration in a changing climate and what it means for Canada. I've got a few slides to share with you. I can't help it. I'm a professor. I love to share PowerPoint slides. And what I'm going to do is just sort of look at the bigger picture, the global picture, and where Canada fits in terms of migration and climate-related migration. It's a subject that I've been working on for quite a number of years now, and I've written a couple books and I've written a book and edited a couple more on the subject of climate and human migration. And as Ali mentioned, I'm no longer working with the IPCC. We actually published our report on February 28th, the Working Group 2 report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability to climate change. I helped coordinate the chapter that focused on climate change impacts on human health, well-being, migration, displacement, and conflict. And so it was a chapter that had a lot of emphasis on the implications of climate change, both now and in the future, for migration within countries and across borders as well. And that's the latter part that I want to focus on today. I picked up the morning newspaper. I'm still one of those old fogies who likes to read the morning paper, the hard copy. And on page 3 of the Globe and Mail, Today, there was this story here that says the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has warned that we are headed towards 100 million people globally displaced. The Ukraine conflict obviously is pushing that number up, but we have people displaced around the world for a variety of reasons, violent conflict, persecution being one of the main ones, but environmentally related displacements have been growing significantly in recent years, and that's where I want to put the focus on. But by showing this this newspaper article today, I just want to emphasize that what Edward and I will be talking about today is not hypothetical. It's stuff that's actually happening right now and needs to be dealt with sooner rather than later, because the numbers of people who are at risk of being involuntarily displaced by climate change only grow in coming decades if we take no action now. The World Bank last year in September released a report suggesting that if nothing is done to address the root causes of climate change, if nothing is done to help low-income countries in the global south improve their socioeconomic standards of living, and if nothing is done in terms of investments to help people adapt to the impacts of climate change, then by 2050, between 150 and 200 million people might be displaced from their homes, especially in low-income countries in the global south because of climate change. Now, 2050 is not all that far off. I hope to see the year 2050. I'll be retired by then, but I still hope to be around. And so this is not that far over the horizon. These are forecasts for the lifetime of people who are joining us on this call today. And this is not some radical environmental organization. This is not Extinction Rebellion. This is not Greenpeace. I wouldn't call them terribly radical, but anyhow, you get my point. This is the World Bank. This is a fairly conservative organization that is dedicated to maintaining the global economy, essentially, who are warning that if we do nothing, there are going to be millions upon millions of people displaced around the world within our lifetime as a result of climate change. So that's a pretty dire warning. If you think about where Canada fits in, and today's topic is about international migration, Canada receives and welcomes large numbers of international migrants each year. And the last year before the pandemic, 2019, the slide that you see here shows the top source countries of people who immigrated for permanent residence to Canada. And so you can see them there, India being the biggest one, but China, the Philippines, Nigeria, Pakistan, United States, Syria, and so on. I'm going to come back to this point in a moment, because the reality is that this is a 2019 snapshot. But remember, if we cast back over the last 20, 30, 40 years, these same countries represent a large portion of the immigrants who've come to Canada in the last few decades. And so we have large diasporic communities of people in Canada from India, from China, the Philippines, Nigeria, and so on. And I want to come back to that in a moment. Okay, displacement, people who are forced from their homes because of weather-related events like storms and floods and droughts and wildfires and so on. These things are already happening right now. In the year 2020, the last year for which we have complete statistics, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva estimates that about 30 million people worldwide were displaced from their homes by these weather-related events. That's almost a Canada's worth of people displaced in a single year. And this trend, like many, is starting to go up. On average, there's about 20 to 25 million people each year displaced by weather-related events. 2020 was a particularly bad one. 2021 was not much better. And so again, this is not hypothetical stuff. These are things that are happening right now around the world. And climate change is only going to exacerbate the problem. It's going to make hurricanes, going to make droughts, going to make floods, going to make extreme storms, going to make wildfires more common. Will increase the frequency of these events, will increase the severity of these events in many cases and in many regions. So the climatic risks keep going up each year for weather-related displacements. And if you look at those same statistics and break them down by the countries where these disasters are occurring, you will see a couple things. One is that China, Philippines, Bangladesh, India, United States, Vietnam, and so on, these are countries that regularly experience extreme storms and floods. And you will see that they include both high income and low income and middle income countries. So you get the whole spectrum of socioeconomic wealth in these countries. The other thing that you see is that I showed you that list before of the top 10 source countries of immigration to Canada. Look how many of them appear on this list. So China, the Philippines, India, United States, Pakistan, these are big source countries of immigration to Canada. They're also countries that experience a disproportionate share of extreme weather events. There's also quite a significant number of Canadians with family ties to Bangladesh, Vietnam, Somalia, Honduras, maybe not so much Indonesia, but certainly Pakistan. In other words, these countries that are highly exposed to climate change risks are also countries to which Canada has very strong social, economic, and family ties. So this is something that I'm going to come back to in a couple moments. And those are the risks that are happening right now. And then the next big risk, which is starting to come at us fairly quickly, is sea level rise. Right now, global sea levels are rising by about 3.5 millimeters per year. Doesn't sound like a lot, but of course, if you live in a low-lying area like Venice that you see on the right-hand side, within 10 years, the water levels have gone up that much. And then within 15 years, they've gone more than my hand can expand. And if your community lies at sea level, that's a real problem for you. And it's already starting to displace people in different parts of the world. In Fiji, there are quite a number of communities right this moment that are being relocated to higher ground because they are right on the coastal plain, because they are highly exposed to storms, because they're highly exposed to erosion, and the people are living in locations that are just no longer tenuous. And it's not just in Fiji, I should mention. Here in Canada, we have communities as well that are extremely vulnerable. If you think about Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories, for example, there's a community that is right at sea level, and it will have to be relocated within the next 20 or 30 years. But I'm focusing on international migration for this little talk here. So this is stuff, again, that's happening right now and that we need to deal with. So the question becomes for this panel, how will this affect international migration as it relates to Canada? Are we going to see more people arriving at Canada Customs seeking entry for reasons related to climate change? Now, it's important to note that you often read in the media the term climate refugees. And Canada does accept refugees. And so people who are displaced by violence, by persecution, by conflict, they can come to Canada and make a refugee claim. But people who are displaced for environmental reasons, you know, their house is destroyed by a storm, their livelihood is lost in a drought, that does not automatically qualify them to migrate to Canada or to any other country for that matter, as a refugee might. So it's a little bit complicated in terms of the legality of this, and maybe some of my other panelists or questions will want to address this issue. But there are some things that we know Canadians have strong connections to, places we have strong connections to, and reasons why we might take a greater interest in international migration for climate-related reasons. Think, for example, the country of Haiti. In Canada, there are a lot of Canadians who have their family origins in Haiti, and it is a country that experiences more than its fair share of extreme storms, and that's likely to continue and even be magnified in coming decades. And in past years, we have, at a global or at a national level, initiated special programs to help reunify Canadians of Haitian origin with loved ones in Haiti when they are displaced by extreme weather events or, you know, within the last decade, an earthquake as well. So we have some precedents already where Canada has said, yes, because of our strong ties to this particular country, we have a role in helping people resettle in the wake of an environmental disaster. I suspect we will see more and more of these events, these sort of migration events happening in the future. There's also a lot of latitude for the government to expand its role in protecting and helping people who've been displaced by a whole variety of reasons. And if you think about, for example, the Kosovar refugees from a decade ago, if you think about Syrian refugees from the conflict from about 5 years ago, if you think about Ukrainian refugees who are fleeing that country right now, Canada has opened its doors, especially to people from those countries who have family ties here, to help them resettle and be reunified here with loved ones. I can foresee a lot of demand and pressure being placed on the Canadian government in coming decades by Canadians wanting to see their loved ones relocated here from regions that are highly exposed or impacted by climate change. So a lot of this pressure for greater migration to Canada because of climate change will actually come internally from Canadian voters, taxpayers, who want to see the Canadian government become more involved. So I'll wrap up with one final slide that says, well, okay, Canada, what are we going to do about this? What are our options for dealing with climate-related disruptions that cause people to lose their homes, to cause people to leave their home countries? Well, there's three things that we can do, and we can start working on them right now. We don't have to wait for the future. First one is to deal with the root cause, right? If you go to the doctor and you've got a cough, the doctor doesn't say, oh, that's terrible, here's a prescription for cough syrup, off you go. The doctor doesn't treat the symptoms. The doctor tries to find the root of the problem. And in this case, what we're talking about, the root of the problem is the fact that Canada's greenhouse gas emissions keep going up and up each year, and not just Canada, but every country around the world. Second thing, so we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and honor our commitments under the UNFCCC. Second thing is that Canada has agreed with a whole bunch of other countries to two global compacts at the UN level. One is the Global Compact for Migration, and the other one is for the Global Compact for Refugees. And these two documents provide blueprints for the international community that say, in the event of people being displaced from their homes for environmental reasons, here's what ought to happen. And so we already have a roadmap or a blueprint or whatever you want to call it on how to deal with this. And Canada has signed on to it, as have other countries. We simply need to follow through on executing it. And the third and final thing we need to do is the Sustainable Development Goals. There are a lot of countries around the world where socioeconomic standards, where education, where healthcare are simply not up to the standards that we expect here in Canada. And Canada has a role in helping poorer countries lift their populations into the same sort of social economic healthcare and other conditions that we have here in Canada. And if we can do that, then people are more robust, more resilient, more able to adapt and cope with the impacts of climate change in the future. And it's just stuff we ought to be doing anyhow. So in conclusion, we have everything that we need in terms of the institutional tools to deal with climate-related displacements and migration around the world. The real thing that's missing is the political will to follow through on all of that. So thanks very much, and I'll turn it back over to Ali.
Thanks, Robert, for sharing that. I am looking forward to discussing some of those points a bit further. Please pop your questions into the question box. I will introduce now to our second panelist, Dr. Edward Shizha. Edward is a professor of youth and children studies at Laurier University. His research focuses on settlement experiences of African immigrants in Canada. Edward recently led a collaborative Laurier study on enhancing access to post-secondary education for male African youth in Southern Ontario. He has authored and edited 12 books, including Living Beyond Borders, essays on global immigrants and refugees, and he's currently working on an edited volume, Intersectionality, Transnationality, and Immigrant Lives, Critical Issues and Approaches to International Migration. Welcome, Edward.
Thank you, Ali. And thank you, Nick, and your team for organizing this conversation, and everybody who has attended. And thank you, Robert, for starting this conversation. I've been working in the area of refugees and immigrants, particularly from those who come from Africa, as Ali has said. I started working in these projects when I was in Alberta, at the University of Alberta, working for the social department of immigrants at the university. And since then, I've continued to work in this area, and I collaborate with some colleagues who are still in Alberta, particularly Michael Kariwo and Edward Makwarimba. And together we were invited by Alberta Association of Immigrant Serving Agencies in 2017 to carry out an environmental scan of mental health services available for immigrants in Alberta. And one of their objectives was to identify who accesses these services and why they did so. And we came across one group that was interesting in terms of who accesses these services and why they do so. And this was a group of foreign trained immigrant professionals and highly skilled workers. So my talk is going to be on why Canada doesn't utilize these people, why I think there's wastage of human capital when it comes to the underutilization of internationally trained professionals and skilled workers. So the reasons why these foreign trained immigrant professionals were accessing mental health services were based on their failure to follow the careers they had gone to school for and received the training in when they were still in their home countries before coming to Canada. So they were accessing mental health services because they were feeling that they had problems in how they feel about themselves. They felt that there was that kind of loss of dignity. There was also loss of self-confidence in themselves. And they also felt a bit of stress and anxiety about the future because they were not accessing the jobs that they were qualified for. They also had these feelings of inadequacy and feelings of not being accepted by the Canadian employers. And overall, they felt that they were being invalidated in terms of their educational qualifications and their training. So if you look at these people, they come to Canada voluntarily. They come here to become permanent residents and ultimately to become citizens. But there are people who are also affected by climate change when this happens in their home countries. Climate change, as Robert has said, affects the socioeconomic statuses of countries and citizens within those countries. So when climate change happens, it means the people in the global south who depend on agriculture and the economies depend on agriculture are affected drastically when climate change happens. For example, the El Nino that happens in some years affects droughts, they cause droughts and floods in some countries. And when this happens, it affects the agriculture, which is the basis of the economies of these countries. So it affects the financial inflow because the production of agricultural produce has been affected. And there won't be much exports that will be done because the countries, the need to have products that come from agriculture for exports. So this will affect also the quality of lives of individuals in the countries. For example, if droughts happen, this means that most companies that depend on agricultural produce will not be productive. And this might lead to job losses and high employment in the country. This might also lead to job insecurity because people are likely to lose their jobs because companies are not performing and they're not producing. And some companies might also end up reducing salaries of workers because there is loss of exports. They are not making a lot of money in terms of the financial inflow. Then there will also be food insecurity that will affect people and increased poverty. So when this happens, you will find that most people who are highly skilled and professionals will decide to look for greener pastures. These are the people who voluntarily decide to leave their countries as immigrants, and they will try to move to the global north where they think there are opportunities. And Canada is one of those countries that will attract these immigrants. When you look at Canada's selection policy, which focuses on the federal skilled trades program or the economic immigrant status or class, it uses the point system that creates high expectations in the professionals and skilled workers. Why is this so? One, if you look at the age group that is required in the point system, it requires people mainly who are between 25 and 44. And these are the people who are economically active in their countries. Secondly, it will also look at people who have attained undergraduate or graduate education levels. And these are the people who have already invested in their education and training. It will also look at those people who are qualified and experienced or skilled in their field of practice. So these are the people who have also been working for a number of years in their countries. And another point is that it will look at those people who are proficient in English and French. So if you consider these points and these requirements, you will find that those who are professionals and who are highly skilled, who have already invested in their education and training, and these are the people who are seeking trade-offs and benefits in terms of social and economic returns, they will see opportunities to migrate to Canada. They will see themselves as people who are qualified to come to Canada. But the fact that Canada is also focusing on these particular areas for those who are migrating, it means it's promising the immigrants that they are likely to do well when they come to Canada. So this point system heightens the expectations of the immigrants. The government of Canada tries to justify why it requires these types of immigrants using the Federal Skilled Workers Program. For example, in a 2020 annual report to Parliament on immigration, the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship reported that the economic immigration class was the largest source of permanent resident admissions in Canada. And it was about 58% of all admissions in 2019, which was 5% higher than in 2018. And also on December 23 in 2021, the same Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship announced that Canada had reached its target of more than 401,000 new permanent residents in 2021 and argued that Canada needs new immigrants to drive its economy and to address labor shortages. I emphasize the term labor shortages. If this was the case, why is it that immigrants who come to Canada to address these labor shortages are not find opportunities to work in careers that they are trained for? If you look at the number of doctors who are in Canada who were trained outside, there are quite a number of them who are not employed. I'll come to the number later on from what has been reported. So the question is, what happens when the highly skilled workers and professionals come to Canada and arrive in Canada? First of all, high expectations have been created by the fact that they see themselves as qualified to migrate to Canada, to come to Canada, and they see themselves as having the right qualifications because the point system is selecting them on the basis of having a good education, work experience, and also knowledge of English or of French. Therefore, they see themselves as having those qualities and qualifications that will make them transition smoothly into Canada, and they expect to get the jobs that they were trained for and in which they acquired work experience. But when they arrive in Canada, these foreign educated and trained immigrants, they'll find that what they had expected is not what they get. That's a reality check. One, their academic qualifications are not recognized. Their training is not recognized. Their work experience is not recognized. So what happens then when this happens? They are de-skilled because the skills they had attained before migrating to Canada are made redundant. They are required to undergo new training in order to be re-skilled. In other words, they are being de-skilled to be re-skilled. They are being de-skilled and de-skilled with the same skills which they had before, which does not make sense to them. They are required to have Canadian work experience, but then the question is, where would they have acquired this work experience and how would they have acquired the work experience? If they are immigrants, it means they were working outside of Canada. The big question is, why is Canada encouraging high-skilled workers and professionals to come to Canada when there are barriers that stop them from applying their knowledge, skills, training, and work experience? Why waste the investment in the human capital that was already developed by the countries of origin? Most of these immigrants end up working jobs that they are overqualified for. Retraining and going back to school requires money, which they might not have. They need to work to support their families, support themselves, and to send remittances to their families back in the home country. So they end up foregoing the retraining that they should do and to focus on survival. As one researcher, Shibao Guo, who is at the University of Calgary, reported, he found that the plight of skilled professional immigrants and the labor force that they bring to Canada is not recognized because these workers suffer unemployment when they arrive in Canada and underemployment. And if they happen to be working, they are working in the jobs that they are overqualified for, and there is poor economic performance and downward social mobility that happens to them, which he attributed to triple glass effect. He said the triple glass effect includes the glass gate, which stops them from coming into the workplace, the glass door that also prevents them from joining the labor force, and the glass ceiling. If they happen to join the labor force, they might not make any advances in their careers. Amar Khan of the Global News on November 13th, 2021, when he was referring to the crisis in the healthcare because of COVID-19, reported that there are foreign doctors in Canada who are ready to help, but these are sidelined by regulations in terms of credentialing and licensing policies. So there are policies that will place a barrier on foreign doctors, foreign trained doctors to work in Canada. And they need also to improve on their credentials for them to be accepted. But remember, these are the doctors who are already working outside of Canada, who have brought their experience and their skills into the country. And Khan also said the International Trained Physicians Access Coalition, which looks at internationally trained physicians and how they are advancing in Canada, it reported that there are more than 13,000 internationally trained doctors in Canada. But these doctors were not working as doctors. And he said that 47% of these doctors are not working in the healthcare field at all. They are working in other areas, in other fields. And if they are working in the healthcare system, some of them have become nurses. So some of these doctors have been discouraged by the policies, licensing policies, and they've forgone their retraining so that they can focus on supporting their families. Is this not a waste of human capital? They could be alleviating the pressure that is found in the healthcare system, the pressure that is being put on the healthcare system by the pandemic. So what do I think should happen in terms of alleviating the mental health of these doctors and what they go through? One suggestion that was put forward by the managing director of World Education Services, Shamira Madej, she proposed that we need to make sure that we have mechanisms and tools in place to leverage the prior skills and experience of economic immigrants. We don't we don't want highly skilled people to come to Canada to do low skilled jobs. A few weeks ago, sometime in February, actually, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, announced that Ontario will introduce legislation to expedite the process for professionals from other provinces seeking certification to ease the strain on the labor market, especially in the skilled trades. And he was saying that the process will take 30 days or less to make these workers get their licenses and certification in Ontario. So when I read the article, initially I thought that they were going to refer to internationally trained professionals as well as skilled workers, but it was focusing on workers from other provinces. So the question is, why doesn't this same policy get extended to foreign trade immigrants? So if this can be done for workers coming from other provinces, maybe the federal government should also have a policy where foreign trained immigrants can be made to license themselves within a short space of time so that they are able to practice within the spheres of their careers. The other suggestion that I have is that maybe there should be a need for actionable policies that really act, policies that focus on reducing the financial strains that come with the retraining, because immigrants do not have the financial resources to go through the retraining process after they had been trained before. They have the skills already that they need to apply. If it means that they have to acquire Canadian experience, then probably they should be attached to the organization that they want to work in, or they should be attached to an employer that they want to work with. Then during that kind of attachment, they're acquiring experience, which they can then utilize when they are hired. So pre-migration assessment of credentials could be one way of making sure that when these immigrants come to Canada, their credentials have already been assessed, their skills have already been assessed, and they are coming to Canada already knowing that they are ready to join the labor market. So to conclude, I'll say that it is important that Canada focuses on trying to use policies that are friendly to immigrants, particularly when you focus on highly skilled immigrants. They come to Canada to provide a service, to work to improve the Canadian economy, as the government says, when it is attracting immigrants. Therefore, they must be provided with that opportunity to use those skills when they come into the country. Okay, thank you. I'll wait for questions later on.
Thank you, Edward, and thank you, Robert, for your very important discussion points. We have a question or a few questions in, so I wanted to encourage also others, anyone who have questions, to put it in the question box, and we will ask those questions. We'll pose those questions to both Robert and Edward. So the first question that I have here is for Robert, and it's asking that the impact, what are the good estimates about how climate change will impact the number of international migrants in the next 30 years moving because of the impact of slow onset climate impacts as opposed to sudden onset impacts look like cyclones? Can we even quantify this specific group?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think it was Tom who asked the question. So when we look at statistics for global migration and displacement patterns, the best source we have is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva. Now, their data looks at people displaced because of conflicts and because of weather-related disasters and because of geotechnical disasters like earthquakes and volcanoes and so on. Now, they only look at the displacement. So the person who's displaced might only move, 6 miles or 60 miles. They might stay within their home country. They might move internationally, but they don't make a distinction about there. They're just looking at people who are displaced because of these events, hence the name internal displacement. So in terms of how many of those people end up becoming international migrants is a real challenge. There are some examples of regional level studies that have looked at this. And again, the numbers are a bit fuzzy. Having given all those caveats now, so in terms of actual statistics, the rapid onset events, the storms, the floods, the cyclones, these tend to be the largest weather or climate related displacement events. And that's projected to continue to be the case out into the future, whether you're talking about internal mobility or international migration. In terms of the slower onset event, so if you think of a drought as a slower onset event, it's a little more challenging, often because there's a lag period between the onset of the dry conditions and the actual migration response. So for example, research done in Mexico has shown that there can be up to a 30 to 36 month lag time between a drought and the completion of the migration signal, if you will. So what that means is, there might be a spike in the number of people migrating from Mexico to the United States from drought-affected areas in rural Mexico, but it takes some time for that actually to emerge. And the reason it takes time is because drought is one of those things where people typically try to cope with it or adapt to it in ways other than, hopping on a bus or a plane and moving elsewhere, right? They try to adapt through changing crops or working off the farm and other ways that don't involve mobility. But once the losses continue to add up or the drought continues to persist, then you start to see the migration response. And then, of course, the biggest slow onset one will be, well, there's two actually. One is sea level rise. And as I said, 3 millimeters per year doesn't sound like much, but by the tail end of this century, there are large areas, even here in North America, that will be very difficult to occupy because of rising sea levels. And a good example would be Miami Beach. There's tens of thousands of people who live right along the beach, essentially in Miami, and those areas will be underwater 50 to 100 years from now if we continue releasing greenhouse gas emissions at the current rate. So that's one of the big ones. The other one is actually extreme temperatures. There are cities in this world, large cities, that currently are in areas where summertime temperatures can go into the 40s in terms of degrees Celsius. And the concern is that as the globe becomes hotter, those summertime temperatures start to reach thresholds where it is physically difficult to exist out of doors. Because it's so hot. Once you get to temperatures 48, 49, 50 and beyond, the human body can't spend much time outside. And so there's a concern that large cities in the hot areas of the planet may see an outflow of people because it's just too hot to live there. Obviously, if you can make sure that everybody in those cities has access to air conditioning and cooling centers throughout the year, you can reduce that risk. But in a lot of countries, we're talking about low and middle income countries, that capacity doesn't exist. So you may actually start to see that's a very slow onset, but it could really change habitability. So thanks for the question.
Thank you, Robert, for those great answers. There are few questions also, so please keep your questions coming and we'll try our best to answer them all. The next question, how does one conflict or emergency trump another in this international migration scenario? How do Western countries, particularly Canada, balance responsibility and equity? So any of you can jump in and answer that question.
Okay, maybe I made the first check. I think Western countries are doing their best when it comes to assisting refugees. When you look at the issue of the Syrian refugees, the Afghanistans, then now the Ukrainians, I think they are supporting immigrants in trying to relocate them to their countries. But what I think should be done is to have a comprehensive policy. Each country should have a comprehensive policy on how it intends to help these refugees. For example, Canada might have its own policy regarding the Afghanistan refugees or the Ukrainian refugees. US might have its own policy, the same with other European countries. But if there was, say, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which coordinates the movements of the refugees, this might stop countries from having haphazard policies. For example, countries come up with policies deciding on how they are going to resettle the refugees. But when the refugees come into the country where they are settling, there might not be available services. And a country might also have a policy like, for example, Canada, which says the current problem in Ukrainian, they are saying they will allow the Ukrainians to come to Canada, get some visas for 3 years to work and study in Canada, but what preparation is put in place when they come to Canada? Do they have any reception centers where they come first to settle, then look for accommodation later? And who pays for their livelihoods? What happens in terms of their mental health? Because they're coming from a situation of trauma, they need support. So I think there must be a kind of policy. It might be a country policy, but then there must be some coordination with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees.
Thanks, Edward. Robert, do you want to add?
Well, yeah, I'd like to highlight for the audience, it may seem that Edward's discussion about migrant settlement and incorporation and mine about climate-related disruptions are only loosely connected with one another. But actually, if you're looking to the future, they will become increasingly connected. And the reason is this, is that Canada is an aging population. Our natural replacement rate, our birth rate is relatively low by global standards. And so to maintain a vibrant economy with a highly skilled workforce, we need immigration, and we're going to need more immigration in coming decades. At the same time, we're going to be living in a world where countries that are highly exposed to the impacts of climate change in Central America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, also tend to have much younger populations and much greater demand for opportunities to enter the labor market, the international labor market. And so I'm not saying that immigration to Canada should and climate change should be seen as a benefit to Canada because we could take advantage of other people's misery to improve our skilled labor pool. But what I am saying is that that skilled migration, not just even skilled migration, but migration generally, if it's done in a regulated, organized, managed fashion, can benefit Canada, can benefit the sending countries as well. And a little example is that a few years ago, I was at a conference, and the former prime minister of a country called Kiribati, which is in the South Pacific. It's a small set of small islands in the Pacific, and essentially 100 years from now, it's going to be underwater. And its citizens are going to have to relocate sooner or later. And the prime minister was appealing to countries like Canada and the United States saying, look, you folks are causing the problem with your greenhouse gas emissions. My country is suffering. How about you allow my country's young people to come to your countries to go to school, to work, to develop skills, to earn money. They'll remit some of that money back home to help their families and build resilience here. And that way, if the day comes when we need to leave our islands, we won't be refugees. We will be highly talented, highly sought after, skilled workers with mobility options and opportunities. And he made that appeal, and it sort of fell on deaf ears. I don't recall any Western country picking up on it. But it's an example of how in countries that are facing these sorts of risks, migration is seen as a way of coping with them at the household level and community level. And so that's a role that Canada can play in terms of opening up our migration to people who we otherwise maybe wouldn't think of as potential migrants to Canada, and facilitating their entry to our country and integration into our schools and workplaces and so on, as part of a global effort to, globally upskill. So I think that's where what I'm talking about and what Edward has been talking about, I think that's where they start to dovetail as we look into the future.
Thank you very much, Robert and Edward, and making those connections and good examples. So we have two questions, and I wanted to use the time that we have left with to kind of like effectively answer those questions, and also have maybe a minute or two for you to conclude. So the next question is for Edward. Do we have any information about what percentage of immigrants in Canada are de-skilled, or any comparison between global South immigrants versus Europeans in the rates of which they are de-skilled? Edward?
That's a good question. The figures that I came across are those that are found in the health sector concerning doctors, because there's an organization that collects these figures. But for other areas, like for example, engineering, lawyers, I haven't come across such data. When you also look at the European figures, the figures that you get are not so much of all the trades, but they focus mainly on the doctors that come into the European countries. It looks like more research and data collection, when it comes to numbers, focuses mainly on the healthcare system, on the doctors, but not in other sectors. And yes, there could be data that also shows how many doctors are de-skilled who come from the global South and how many from the global North. But it's mostly those who come from the global South that are de-skilled. And a few years back, I think in Canada, there was a kind of an experiment that was being made with doctors who came from the global South, but these were mainly from South Africa, and they happen to be white doctors. So you'll find that most of those who are de-skilled are racialized doctors or racialized professionals. Those who come from the North, who are preferred, easily get opportunities, maybe because there's similarity in the way that they are trained in Europe, as well as in terms of similarity in Canada and Europe, but they are seen as big differences when it comes to those who are trained from the global South. So more people from the global South are de-skilled compared to those who come from the North.
Thank you, Edward. We'll take that as the last question. So I'm sorry that we're running out of time, and we've got a few more questions come. So I'll give both Robert and Edward, and we'll start with Robert. And maybe in your concluding remarks, if you want to answer any of the questions that might be fitting with your conclusions, please go ahead. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, to everybody who has been attending today's event, and thank you for your considerations. I'll just start by saying that I enjoyed the talk that Edward gave earlier, and I really appreciate his work that he's been doing. In the Q&A, there was a question about, well, what should Canada's policy be? Where can we expect, the demand for migration to Canada to come from in the future, and what should Canada be doing? I think in terms of right now, Canada's immigration policy tends to be reactive when we talk about people being displaced from their homes. So we sort of, there's a crisis in Ukraine, so let's put together something in a hurry. There's been an earthquake in Haiti. Let's see if we can put something together in a hurry. I think the time has come to start to transition towards a more systematic approach, to put into place the regulations and programs and policies, because this is going to happen over and over again in greater frequency. So a more systematic approach, identifying what countries are more likely than others to be exposed to the risks of climate change. And we know what those are. And what countries here are represented amongst the Canadian population. And so where are the connections going to be? And then how can we engage civil society, the government, and the governments of the sending countries as well in a more managed and systematic approach. I think we're going to see demand coming at us from places we never thought we'd see it before, maybe from the United States, parts of the United States, countries that historically have had no strong ties to Canada in terms of immigration. I think we'll see more. So I think that we're at the point in time where we have enough knowledge and information to start becoming more systematic in our thinking. So I'll turn it over to Edward now, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you, Robert. I will address a question that was also raised in the chat concerning the immensity and severity of the impacts that the de-skilling of immigrants in Canada has had. Well, I think the impact and severity is on two levels. The first is that once the professionals and highly skilled workers leave their country to come to Canada, they're creating a gap in the home country. These were the people who were supposed to assist in the development of the country. They were the people who were supposed to fill the gap of required workforce in their country. But now by leaving, they are creating another shortage in the home country. So coming to Canada, they find themselves not occupying the positions that they expected to occupy. So the de-skilling has got an effect of one, making them lose their skills. And at the same time, losing their skills means they are going to work in low-paying jobs. Low-paying jobs do not offer much to them. At the same time, they are facing pressure to support their families in Canada, and they also have to support their families back home. And secondly, when they get de-skilled, if they need to retrain, it means they are also reinvesting a lot of money in the training which they had already. So they are only retraining to reskill themselves with the skills that they had been de-skilled. So one, it has a negative impact in terms of how they perceive themselves and how they also perceive their own education. And the other impact is also on the aspect that somehow the financial resources that is channeled towards retraining could have been used to develop themselves here in Canada. So it means they are suffering in terms of falling backward in terms of social and financial development. So they suffer that downward mobility. If one was a doctor before, then now the person is now a nurse, then there is that kind of social downward mobility. It reminds me of a picture that I saw in a social media platform. I come from Zimbabwe. So in one of those platforms, there was a lady who was wearing scrubs and had a stethoscope around her neck. And there was a caption that says, a doctor in Zimbabwe and a PSW in Canada. So what it showed was that people believe that those professionals who leave their home country to come to Canada do not make it in Canada. They go down in terms of the social ladder. They lose the respect that they had and occupy these new positions which offer them very little. So there are a number of impacts that de-skilling has on professional workers who come to Canada.
Thank you very much, both Robert and Edward, for your great points and discussions and making those connections for us. I've learned a lot from being part of this conversation, and thank you to everyone who have attended, listened, and posed questions. Our inspiring conversations will return in June, so stay tuned for an email in May. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.